In today's world, I'm constantly reminded of the boundaries that separate one country from another, borders to be crossed, passports to be checked. And yet, from an airplane or satellite view of the Earth, there are no borders, only a wonderful mosaic of colours that delineate the Earth's natural regions, the grasslands, prairies, and tundra. The boreal forest is the largest of these natural regions. It wraps itself around the top half of the Earth, from North America to Europe and Asia. It is one of our most important ecosystems. Hello, I'm Anne Martin, and I invite you to join me now on Top of the World as we discover why 1 million acres of this boreal forest in a park in Canada have been the focus of attention of American, British, French, and Russian scientists. In the centre of Western Canada, surrounded by prairie farmlands and a long way from busy streets and busy lives, is an important tract of wilderness. It's large, it's old, and it's very, very quiet. It's also something of a bellwether for our world. Billions of years ago, long before dinosaurs ruled the world, life began deep under the oceans. As microorganisms mixed with sunlight through the miracle of photosynthesis, oxygen was created. As the oxygen rose, it in turn was changed by ultraviolet light into ozone high above the Earth's surface. The thin gauze of ozone would become the protecting tent under which life could flourish on the land. In a wondrous revolution, oxygen had created the very barrier which would allow life on Earth. 1 billion years later, the dinosaurs came and went, and ice covered the land as high as a 100-story building. When the glaciers retreated, a new land was reclaimed from the ice, and in a wide stripe that encircled the top of the world, a forest grew. So we come to this century, and the efforts of the Canadian government to preserve this precious landscape. Parks and sanctuaries were created. And then, in 1925, in Saskatchewan, 1 million acres of boreal wilderness, this northern forest, where the prairie gives way to the lake country, was given a new gift of life. Prince Albert National Park was born. The park is only 90 kilometers north of the city of Prince Albert, but it's a world apart. There is a subtle beauty and a peacefulness. It is large enough for swimming, boating, and water skiing, yet remote enough for canoeing and backpacking. Every year, thousands of people come here to play and to reflect, for recreation and solitude. More and more, the park's environment is being appreciated. The remoteness of the park and its undisturbed environment has made it a perfect location for two very important studies, both vital in the need to preserve the boreal wilderness and monitor its ecology for this and future generations. The first project began in 1993. 10 model forests were established across Canada, 10 gigantic living laboratories, their objectives being to find new ways to meet the challenges of forestry and environmental issues unique to each region. The park became a partner in the Prince Albert Model Forest.
But the problem is animals such as wolves, fish, the air, the seeds of the trees, everything moves across these boundaries and doesn't pay any attention to, whether it's in the park or whether it's not in the park, whether it's on a forestry lease area or whether it's on an Indian reserve. The animals don't pay attention to that, and nature really doesn't pay attention to that. So we've got to try to manage the ecosystem as a whole unit, and try to coordinate so that we're not working against each other, we're working with each other.
In a fresh approach of respect for the forest, the logging industry, First Nations, environment and science are partners in the Prince Albert Model Forest, collaborating on forestry issues and searching for better solutions. A year later, as part of Earth Science System, a vast undertaking involving all the major natural regions of the world, scientists came here to Prince Albert National Park to study the boreal forest and its impact on the climate around the top half of the planet.
The Boreas project actually is one of a series of projects which have been carried out internationally. What we're trying to do is to take the whole Earth's surface, divide it into a patchwork of different biomes, and say, how does each one interact with the atmosphere? What we really want to be able to do is to quantify the role of the boreal forest in the bigger picture. In other words, the Earth as a system. We're developing the science of interpreting the data so that we can tell things like forest cover, species change, how wet is the surface, what's the biomass. It's all of these parameters or those descriptions of the boreal forest that you need in order to know how it's functioning and how it's changing.
Scientists from around the globe here to study the boreal forest. How intricate is this self-contained world? Could its evolution be a key to the future of our planet's existence? And why has Prince Albert National Park been chosen as the best place to study the complexities of its food chains and ecosystems within ecosystems?
The boreal forest is one of the largest terrestrial ecosystems on the entire face of the planet. And most of the northern hemisphere is covered with boreal forest. It covers more than a third of what Canada is landmass. And of that area, we're just on the southern edge here in Prince Albert National Park. It's an area typified by long, cold winters and a very short growing season. And the forests that are a result of that are predominantly coniferous forests. There's a mixed forest as well, but the biggest proportion are coniferous trees like spruce, pine, and fir. And there's tremendous volumes of gases being exchanged. It's like, well, something like the lungs of the earth. People like to make an awful lot about the importance of the rainforest, and certainly it is one of the organs of the earth, but the boreal forest is also one of the vital organs of the earth because of its immense size.
What makes Prince Albert National Park so ideal to explore is that its southern boundary is right where aspen parkland gives way to boreal forest. The transition is exciting for researchers. From the air, the park is like a patchwork quilt sewn by a committee. Each square is determined not by the whim of the quilt maker, but by the kind of trees, their height and age, by the effects of climate and fire, the shape of the land, and the mosaic of soils left behind randomly by the retreating glaciers. It is almost a map of creation. For 5 white months, winter's frosty cloak covers the park, and you can imagine the land as it once was, a wilderness created by water in all its states. Some 500 million years ago, the seas swept in, laying down sediments of shales and limestones. Then glaciers crawled down from the north, chiseling out the face of the park, a dent here, a scar there. 25,000 years ago came the Wisconsonian, the last and greatest of these glaciers, and as it retreated, it ground all the rocks that had been deposited by earlier glaciers into a fine material.
It's mostly a glacial till, a finely ground assemblage of sand and gravels that has been sorted by the meltwaters as they ran off the edge of the glaciers or as they plunged into crevasses and were deposited. So you have, in the center of Prince Albert National Park, a large set of hills, the Waskesiu Hills, which are basically glacial moraine. On the far side, the eastern side of the park, you have an even larger area where the glaciers sat in one place for a time. It's called a recessional moraine. It kind of piled up more hills, and we call those the Spruce River Highlands. The larger lakes are basically scoured out by the glaciers.
Before the coming of plant life, the glaciers left behind bare ground, but it was quickly invaded by mosses, algae, and lichens, which, since they do not have roots, were able to colonize the bare rock. Lichens are the real pioneers. These self-sufficient little organisms, a kind of micro-ecosystem in themselves, can live on nutrients in the air that surrounds them, the waters that wash over them, and even absorb minerals from the very rocks on which they grow. As this minute vegetation decomposed, organic soil was formed, and in this welcoming environment the first plants put down roots.
On an exposed hillside, say at the edge of a road, where the gravel and sand and things like that are kind of unvegetated, you can get a good idea of the process of recolonization. And it all starts off with the tiniest of organisms, things like soil algae and lichens. And you can look down and take a close look at some of these. They actually start to form a crust over the surface. And you can see the greens in there where the algae is growing along with the rest of the lichens. You can even see some tiny mosses starting up. Eventually these will coalesce and form a continuous layer, and it will provide a good seed bed for other plants.
Moisture and a little sunlight is all it takes to keep lichen in business. The formula is simple. Water, solar energy, and carbon dioxide make starch and oxygen. However, these tiny, colorful, and odd-shaped generators of life also absorb pollutants and radioactivity. Like litmus paper, they are an environmental warning system.
At the base of this dead balsam poplar, we see covered with moss more or less on the north side of the tree, and some small reproductive structures growing up from the mosses here, these right there and there. And then intermingled is a little bit of the bracket fungi all through here. And I noticed a couple of places where it looks like the tops of that bracket fungi has been colonized by some algae. So it's given a bit of that green color. The fungi itself doesn't have any chlorophyll, so it doesn't photosynthesize, but the algae grows on top and around it. These bracket fungi will be decomposing the tree. Fungi have various different ecological roles, and you're less likely to find as many of these on some of the living trees. But many of these plants, you see, it's middle of winter, but they're still green. And in addition to the evergreen needles on the spruce and pine trees, you see this kind of situation where they're wintergreen and other vascular plants, but also the mosses, which retain their chlorophyll. This gives them a competitive advantage. So any day that the temperature does increase and there's sunlight, there's a better chance that they'll be able to start photosynthesizing. And that's a big advantage of a lot of northern plants, is evergreenness, to take advantage of the short growing season. Okay, so the boreal forest is an evergreen forest, but much of that evergreenness is actually beneath the snow. And if you dig down and take a close look, you can find some examples of that. And I'm just going to move the snow away here, and what have I got? A little bit of some feather mosses of some kind there, a little bit of emerald green. What else? I see some pyrola, or some wintergreen itself, some maybe a pink wintergreen leaves, a bit there. And then we probably have some bits of horsetail as well. There are some species of horse, there's a good handful of it hiding out there, some species of horsetails which are evergreen throughout the winter. So there's lots of color down there all winter long.
And in the eternal cycle of nature, lichens, mosses, and grasses would have been food for some of the first animals to arrive here after the retreat of the glaciers. That food held energy captured from the sun during photosynthesis, energy that passed into the grazing animals. Back and forth the energy flows through the cycles of eating and being eaten. This food chain is not so much a length of chain as a necklace. For ecologists to understand how energy enters the ecosystem and then passes through it, they must study the feeding relationships between organisms. Animals are a precious part of our ecosystem. Before the advent of Europeans, the total population of wild bison was estimated between 40 and 60 million. By the end of the last century, they were facing extinction.
This is the only free-roaming bison herd plains bison herd in a national park in Canada. And they came from a transplant that was made by the Saskatchewan Department of Natural Resources in 1969, north of the park. The habitat proved unsuitable for them there, and between 4 and 6 animals wound up finding refuge within the park, and they've been protected, and they've grown to a herd of somewhat in excess of 100 animals. We have in the past found evidence that traditionally plains bison did inhabit this area, and now with their reintroduction into the ecosystem that's complete with predators and the natural grasslands and everything, we feel they're a very unique component to the ecosystem and a very valuable addition to the wildlife in the park.
The bison were grazing in the sedge meadows. For the Wapiti, a Shawnee name meaning white rump, winter brings a diet of horsetail and mushrooms. If they're starving, these elk will even eat pine needles. By comparison, deer are browsers, living on buds and sapling twigs year-round. All are vulnerable to sudden attack by wolves and other predators.
Prince Albert National Park has between 60 and 100 wolves, a healthy population and definitely a viable population of wolves. And in this area of the boreal forest, their primary prey are white-tailed deer and elk, and then moose, according to size, because it's easier for a pack of 6 or 8 wolves to bring down a relatively small deer as compared to a 2,000-pound bull moose.
In the park, drama unfolds as a family of bald-headed eagles try to outwit the otters who live in the lake below. It's a perfect scenario for the eagles. Water is frozen and food scarce, and so as the otters emerge, the eagles swoop down in the hope that they will scare the otters away from their catch. But all the eagles are getting are a few tasty morsels, quite insufficient for their huge appetites. Circling above is one of their youngsters, eagerly watching the parents to see how it's done. Next, the adults resort to Plan B. One eagle heads to a different vantage point on the lake, while the one on the ice makes a big show of leaving. The otters sound the all clear and return to the ice with a major catch. The eagle swoops down again, but the otters retreat just in time. Believing the eagles have finally tired of trying to outwit them, the otters relax and enjoy their meal. The location is perfect with the fast-flowing currents preventing the ice from completely freezing over. Water and food is available on the coldest day. You can see the potential for an ideal relationship between the eagles and otters if it weren't for the fact that eagles have been known to eat baby otters. Now, just when they least expect it, in comes the rearguard action. One otter is almost caught napping. He just manages to get away with the fish and his life. Privileged to watch these wilderness dramas, you know that sooner or later the eagles will grab the otter's catch, or perhaps the otter itself. The life cycle of the park is fascinating. As plants and wildlife die, they decompose, generating carbon dioxide and nitrogen that enrich the soil and restart the cycle. Every step of the way, energy is exchanged. Each ecosystem can support only a precise amount of life depending on the water and food available. When it's out of balance, the weakest link will suffer and die until the system finds a new order. Here in the boreal forest, life has adapted to the extreme cold of winter with its deep snow that shelters a hidden world. The red fox, his front paws severely lacerated by the ice, also struggles to survive in a world where water is frozen and the next meal hidden by snow under a crust of ice. Down amongst the mosses and leaves, colonies of mice, shrews, and voles tunnel away in their temperature-controlled environment.
They're much too small to survive at minus 30 or minus 40 above the snow. So they'll tunnel through small spaces at the base of the snowpack where it has been changed or metamorphosed because of the heat. If you are a red fox or a great gray owl, then those are your major food supplies, along with some of the larger prey like squirrels and grouse and snowshoe hare, but you'll still depend upon the small mammals beneath the snowpack. And as a red fox, you'll have to hunt them by sound alone. You'll have to listen for them creeping along and tunneling through the snow, and then use your front paws to break through the snow, and if you can, and you're accurate enough, pin the small mammal beneath your paws in the snow, but then bite down on it and consume it. So that's, one of the tiny connections between life under the snow and life above the snow.
Someone who understands that connection better than most is Dr. John Pomeroy, a snow scientist with the National Hydrology Research Centre in Saskatchewan. In 1993, the centre became a partner in the Prince Albert Model Forest project. The snowman, Dr. Pomeroy, and his team were to study the forest's unique ability to survive on its own, to be able to control its own water supply, restore nutrients to its soil, and even keep an eye on its own thermostat.
Well, there are various mechanisms by which it controls its climate. In the winter, for instance, the trees intercept snow. They capture about a third of the snow which falls, and this evaporates out. And this happens in a spruce forest or a conifer forest. In aspen forest areas will not capture the snow. This regulates the amount of snow available in the springtime and the stream flow conditions.
Hauling the scientific equipment behind him, Newell Hedstrom, a former Olympic athlete, is putting his skills to good use as a key member of the team.
What we're really trying to do is a budget, much like a financial budget, but in this case it's a budget of energy and water. And so we look at the energy coming into the system from the atmosphere, solar radiation, warm winds which blow down into the forest, and we also look at what's moving out of the forest. We look at what's entering the soil and moving out of the soil.
Every little disturbance in the life of the forest is watched and measured by the snowman and his team of scientists. The sun's warmth, the volume of water, the amount of rain, and the depth of the snow. In one study, they weighed the snow that fell on a suspended jack pine tree.
That's a weight in grams.
We were rather surprised with some of the results we had. Our jack pine tree accumulated 33 kilograms of snow, a single tree. And of that snow, only 9 kilograms ever made it to the ground. The rest evaporated back up into the atmosphere. So this is several things. One is a very important source of water vapor in midwinter in the center of the continent, and otherwise a very dry atmosphere. The second thing is that under the trees, you'll find a very shallow snowpack. This melts out very early, and so the ground there becomes snow-free first. And this gives these conifers a little bit of an advantage in the springtime. The aspen trees won't have this advantage. The snowpack that you see in the profile, the snow crystals there are completely reformed from what fell initially. And this is because of the heat release from the soil modifies the snow over the winter.
Well, I think we have probably three layers with the last week of warm temperature. Most of the middle layer here is gone quite uniform, with the size of the crystals in the profile getting much larger as we get to this coarse hoar right at the bottom layer. This crust of about 2 or 3 centimeters has been created on the surface. The particles that are probably the most interesting are that are right at the very bottom, where we get to see some columnar crystals. Yeah, here's a good example of some needle crystal just right off the end there.
Now what happens over the winter, the snow sitting in the canopy and on the ground acts as a filter, and it picks up nutrients, particularly nitrogen, from the atmosphere. When melt occurs, the chemicals have moved from the inside of the snow crystals to the outside. That's the first bit that melts, and that's where the chemicals and nutrients flush immediately down to the snowpack. So you have 6 months of storage, maybe 3 or 4 days of release directly into the soil. And the first water that enters the soil has the most nutrients. So that's a very important thing, because it's relatively warm and it's rich. Then in the spring, it's the first sign of life in the forest as things wake up occurs actually in the snowpack. So the snow begins to melt, the water flows down in fingers down into the ground. As soon as this very nutrient-rich water hits the soil, small snow algae wake up from a dormant life form and swim up the flow fingers up to the upper part of the pack where there's a fair bit of sunlight. They then bloom into algae blooms, which are then fed upon by other small microorganisms, and eventually up to snow fleas, which you can see in the pack. These are captured by snow spiders. It all dies and the snow mold begins to consume it. So you have a complete life cycle occurring in the pack, really before anything else wakes up in the forest. Why it's really critical is that this gives a kickstart to the whole ecosystem in the spring. It provides initial food source for everything else as the plants under it begin to wake up and the other animals become active. This is a very important time in the streams. This is when the fish spawn. This is when a lot of the small aquatic wildlife comes to life and begins to reproduce and things like this. So it's tremendously important. There's a lot of energy, water, nutrients rushing through the landscape right now.
In a long struggle, reminiscent of the 100 Years' War, trees in Prince Albert National Park fight. Fight for essential nutrients, for survival and supremacy. They are all different, but highly competitive. The design of conifers is brilliant. Their boughs are sloped so that snow can slide off, minimizing winter damage. Right down to their particular needles and seeds, they have all adapted to fit this ecosystem. The tiny needles are waxy coated to withstand the intense cold and drought of winter. The reduced leaf area lessens water loss by evaporation, and the stomata or breathing pores are located in a groove on the underside of the needles. By not losing too many needles at once, conifers conserve energy and nutrients and can photosynthesize at temperatures as low as -6 degrees. Conifers have a further defense against the rigors of the north. If the bark is damaged, a sticky resin quickly covers the wound, preventing attack by bacteria and fungi. The trees have even adapted to fire, a natural part of the cycle in the boreal forest.
Jack pines have seeds that are released after fires. The seeds then colonize an area after the fire, and the trees all grow up at the same time, so they're very even-aged stands. Aspen trees will often grow in an area where a single tree is a parent, more or less, to all the rest of those trees, and because it's a system of cloning, they're connected by root suckers. So after a fire, or where there's been a major disturbance, you might have 100,000 of these tiny little aspens popping up all over the place.
And the aspens have their own solution to the problems of ultraviolet radiation.
When we're looking at the side of an aspen tree exposed to the sun, we'll often find that the trunk is coated with a very fine chalky powder, or bloom as it's called. You can actually brush this off with your hands. This is like a sunscreen. It reflects the sun and helps keep the tree that much cooler.
It's hard to believe that 2/3 of the land was once covered in trees, one big forest, but the seemingly endless supply has not lasted. We have exploited the forest, ignored its needs, and even squabbled over its management. In a fresh approach to resolving age-old conflicts, Prince Albert National Park has joined as a partner with scientists, First Nations, naturalists, and industry to form the Prince Albert Model Forest. 10 model forests established across Canada, and each one resolved to work together to find better solutions for the good of the forest. As people enjoy the park, All around them, others are trying to resolve the issues of jobs versus the environment, of native land rights and of animals and wildlife that know no boundaries. While the rest of the world soaks up the benefits away from the stresses of the city.
Whether we use the forest to gather mushrooms or for trapping or for recreation, for aesthetics, or for fiber products, such as a company like Weyerhaeuser uses the forest for. We all depend on it, and we depend on its sustainability, and we want to maintain those ecosystem functions in the forest.
The approach may not be very far removed from that of the traditional inhabitants, the woodland Cree.
The forest had spiritual values, the forest was used for their livelihood. That kind of forest management ensured that all aspects of the forest environment were sustained over centuries. So I think we are going back now, in a way, conceptually, we are going back to the traditional approach to forest management, which integrates all values.
Logging has not been permitted in the park since its creation, and this provides an ideal contrast in which to study the effects of regeneration just outside of the park with stands inside the park.
The greatest satisfaction is to go back into areas that were being harvested when I first came here over 20 years ago and walk around in those regenerated cutovers and look at the trees that are now 15, 20 feet high and feel comfortable that this whole thing works and that what we're doing today is going to look like that 20 years down the road.
But as more logging operations are planned in the region, there are some nagging worries that although the forest will grow again and look the same, it could indeed be different.
What our findings are suggesting now is that if you remove the forest cover vegetation, you get a hotter, drier environment in summer and a more severe environment in the winter in regenerating clear cuts. Even when we've got pine trees going up to about 12 feet high, Dr. Granger, my colleague at the Institute, has found that they don't behave like a natural forest. They don't take the energy in the same way and cool things off, transpire in the same manner. So it looks like a forest, it has the shapes and the leaf area of a forest, but it doesn't act like a natural forest. What you have to do with a clear cut is really to simulate what happens in a natural environment. In this area, the white spruce have a great deal of difficulty out in an open field because there isn't enough vegetation to cool off the environment, and so temperature goes above 35 Celsius, they're stressed out and they die. If you have a cover of aspen trees, even aspen bushes, maybe 10 feet high around these spruces, they shelter them, they shade them, and they cool off the environment around the spruce. So it's a bit of a symbiotic relationship. The spruce need the aspen to survive, but then eventually the spruce will shade out the aspen.
As business and science work hand in hand on the model forest, there is a sense that no hurdle is insurmountable, that the Partnership for Progress will iron out wrinkles without damaging the fabric of the forest. Nearly a century ago, newspapers carried a wildlife story that put the park on the map and an embarrassed blush on some faces. A hunter, having killed a beaver, felt responsible for its orphaned family and set up home, beavers and all, in a cabin in the wilderness. The man became known to the world as Grey Owl, a writer and speaker, a conservationist and world traveler. But Grey Owl was not a native Canadian.
The greater public certainly was of that mind that he was a half-breed Indian, and that he was coming from the wilds of Canada to tell this story. He was really an Englishman. His name was Archibald Bellany from Hastings, England. When he emigrated to Canada as a young man, he embarked on a complete transition of his lifestyle from a young, well-to-do Englishman into a half-breed bushman. In short, he became a conservationist rather than a hunter and a trapper. And he became very famous for his books and his films and his lecture tours, inspiring people about the beauty of the Canadian wilderness and the need to protect that.
Grey Owl, his wife Anna Harko, and his pet beavers lived here on Ajuan Lake. His books encouraged protection of the forest and its wildlife. But when he died in 1938, the myth died with him. Grey Owl was exposed as a fake. His life in the northern woods was dismissed as a hoax. Yet his work and his vision have endured.
Well, maybe Gray Owl summed it up. He said, "I bring you what? A single green leaf." His single green leaf was a symbol of that tremendous variety of wilderness and nature that in our day-to-day lives we seem to forget or lose touch with. And I hope that that doesn't happen in places like national parks, and that some of that same message can translate beyond the boundaries of national parks into cities, and so that we enrich our lives there as well with those kinds of connections.
Most of Canada's wildlife call the boreal forest home, but amongst the more industrious residents of Prince Albert National Park are descendants of grey owls beavers, nature's own loggers.
It's a mature trembling aspen, probably around 70 or 80 years, something like that, for this growing site. And obviously they felled it, and it just happened to end up in the creek bed. And as you can see, they've cut off the upper branches. They've topped the tree after it's been down. They'll use those upper branches for the dam and the lodge, and the smaller branches and leaves, of course, they'll use as feed, either incorporating them into the dam or lodge, or probably into a food raft for the wintertime. They'll excavate canals because they're never sure of how deep the water is going to be, and when it freezes over in the wintertime, they have to have enough depth so that they can keep traveling underneath the ice and get out to their food rafts and to the lodge, from the lodge and the dam. There are situations in the summertime when the beaver are out on the surface where they may be taken by a coyote or a wolf. They're relatively safe in the wintertime, though, because they're locked inside the protection of their lodge. They're still active, they don't hibernate, but they're very well protected. The lodge is maybe 6 or 8 feet high, covered in snow, but at the crown there is a small opening or chimney where the beaver haven't put a lot of mud or the plaster for their house, so that the warm air rising from the interior of the lodge is allowed to escape through this vent, and then it forms an ice surface around the edge of the vent, and on very cold days these elaborate crystals, as the more moisture-laden air rising freezes fairly quickly.
Wherever there is water in the park, there are beavers engineering their own water world. Their dams create bogs, where stagnant water reacts to layers of sediment to give off methane gases. The peat bottoms are also slow to thaw in the spring, and it's possible to walk across the bogs on the frozen mattress of sphagnum and muskeg. Sphagnum is an ancient moss that can absorb up to 20 times its weight in water. The sphagnum forms a floating blanket over the bog and slowly but surely aids in the transition of a glacial lake into a forested land.
In the center of the fen here, it's become very wet and sloshy.
Yeah, slosh along.
Yeah.
A little bit of sphagnum right down in here too.
Right down in here and flood it out. About the only tree that really likes the fen and can grow here is the larch or tamarack over towards the edge, and they can survive because they're very hardy. They withstand very severe freezing of the roots, and also in the spring this is frozen, but the leaves warm up. That's very stressful for a typical tree because it is a drought stress, but the tamaracks survive that quite well, and that's why they can live in a bog, is actually because they don't mind drought, which is a bit of a reverse.
Right. You know, hardly anyone ever gets into a place like this because it's so wet and sloshy. One good thing about this park is that we've got that boundary bog nature trail. From summertime, we usually will take the general public or maybe even school groups out to places like Boundary Bog and experience some of this kind of fen and muskeg environment.
They caught a leech! I got something. That's it. Dip Molly and upside down, guys. Find a leech!
When the increasing acidity of the bog slowed down the process of decomposition and thus the release of essential nitrogen, the pitcher and sundew plants found their own solutions. They became carnivorous. As the sensitive hairs of the plants are triggered by protein-rich insects, they close and digest their victims. In order to work the trap, the plants use the acid of the bog.
This is the creek, mud creek that flows from Amiskawon Lake down to Waskesiu Lake. This little misfit creek in the bottom of a glacial meltwater channel. It kind of winds gently back and forth and back and forth, and it's excellent habitat for lots of species. Moose and beaver, of course, dam it up and make more habitat for other species. There's a fascinating relationship between the roots of the trees, of these coniferous trees, and fungi that live underneath the ground. Over the millions of years of evolution, it seems that the fungi have, in close proximity to the roots, have actually started to grow in amongst the roots of the conifers and wrap themselves around in sheaths. The roots then benefit from this relationship because the fungus can take up more nutrients than the root itself could, all its own. And in turn, the fungus will get some basic and simple sugars from the tree via the roots. So it's this relationship that actually helps the trees to colonize areas and to thrive because of this so-called mycorrhizal association. Myco being the mushroom or fungus part of it, and rhizal being the root of the tree. So it's a symbiotic relationship. There are many examples throughout the forest, and this is one of the fascinating ones that helps the trees to thrive.
You know, fungi just never get enough credit for their role in the ecosystem. Some of them can come up through the ground virtually overnight. You know, it doesn't take 24, 48 hours maybe for them to pop. And what we're looking at is just the fruiting body, just the reproductive structures. What's really amazing, and we'll never get a footage of it, are all the fungal fingers that spread out underneath the forest floor and link this forest with the rest of the organisms.
Over 100,000 kilometers of these fungal fingers may weave through a cubic meter of soil. Whether it's the aspen protecting itself against ultraviolet radiation or the lichens absorbing radioactive fallout, all of these ecosystems, the lakes and bogs, fungi and beaver dams, can provide us with warning signals of environmental problems. The park is an ecological pulse. As our society generates more and more greenhouse gases, which warm the atmosphere and threaten to change our climate, scientists from around the world have turned to wilderness areas for answers. They have created Boreas, the Boreal Ecosystem Atmosphere Study. Russians and French, British, Canadian and Americans, each an expert in one small part of the problem, with NASA space missions giving literally an overview, and it's all been taking place here in Prince Albert National Park. Like monitoring a canary in a coal mine, the forest's reactions to crisis may give the world a chance to change its ways.
With Boreas, we're trying to understand how the boreal forest and the atmosphere work with each other to produce the local climate and the climate around the top half of the world. And we're doing this because we think that with increasing CO2, the climate might change, particularly in the continental interiors and close to the poles. So the scientific sort of consensus is that we'll see the largest changes in the boreal forest more than any other ecosystem in the world.
200 scientists and 100 additional support staff working in 80 teams converging on the park throughout all 4 seasons over a 3-year period. Using all sorts of complex equipment, computers and advanced technology, and the objective being to study every aspect of the park's ecosystem, such as the caribou moss. from the smallest leaf to the tallest tree, from snowflakes to beaver ponds, everything measured from the ground to space. 11 research teams established flux tower sites. Each one covered a different biome, a different portion of the boreal forest. There were tower sites at beaver ponds, in fens, amidst jackpine forests, and one in an aspen forest.
This site was chosen because of the large expanse of aspen trees here. It's quite visible from a satellite, for example. And they were looking for a large homogeneous stand of aspen trees. They are doing measurements right at the leaf level, say looking at the photosynthesis going on with a small clump of aspen leaves, right up to the tower level where they're taking measurements showing the overall exchange of carbon dioxide and energy, and then satellite measurements going on. So it was scaled up, really, at a variety of levels. NASA was a very big player in the whole project.
Then we have 4 aircraft that are completely different. They're equipped with probes and little instruments that measure the exchanges of gases between the surface and the atmosphere. And most of these guys sort of fly a kamikaze route above the forest, just a few feet above the forest, and they measure what's going in and out of the forest over quite long distances. And this gives us a way to sort of see what the whole large area is doing in terms of exchanging stuff between the surface and the atmosphere.
Measurements from the surface to the tower to the aircraft to the satellites are all tied together so that the results can be extrapolated to the full biome. And with today's technology, results are coming out on a daily basis.
Everyone assumed you wander around the boreal forest and you get, water up to your knees and you fall over and do face plants and it's wet. But that's not what the atmosphere sees. What the atmosphere sees is mainly the sunlight hits the surface and just gets turned into hot air rising off the forest, thermals and things, and not much evaporation. It almost looks like an arid zone when you're flying over it. You wouldn't be surprised to see that over Spain in midsummer. You are surprised to see it over Canada in the late spring, where you expect to be damp and wet and just a lot of moisture in the air.
The amount of data collected in Boreas is absolutely mind-boggling. You can appreciate that if you measure something 20 times per second for a year, that you have a fair amount of data. Then all that data has to be integrated with all the other data that was collected during Boreas. Each one of us in Boreas was dependent on other scientists for the full picture.
And when all the studies are complete and we understand the interaction between the boreal forest ecosystem and the northern climate, will we also have some answers to the controversial issue of global warming?
We have to be patient, and even after we know how each of these biomes work, which may take another 10 or 15 years, we still can't answer the question about global warming with certainty, because there are many other processes which we have no control over. But this information is vital if we're going to make more accurate predictions.
Nature can't keep pace with the rate that humans change the environment. Certainly there'll still be plants that will be growing here, different species, but some of the animals that need the species that are here now may not be able to adjust and move into those new areas and survive. Certain species need a boreal forest, certain species need an aspen forest.
We have only been on this planet for a blink of a solar eye. Yet in that short time, we've changed the chemistry of our atmosphere 100 times faster than is natural. Perhaps here in Prince Albert National Park, there is a chance that we can learn to catch our breath and change our ways before it's too late. Here we are less likely to be overwhelmed by nature. There are no mountains nor any oceans to dwarf us. This is a world writ small enough for us to grasp. If we can but learn from it, we can appreciate that this ecosystem is a portrait of life itself.
I think what I've gained is a better appreciation of the idea of balance in society and the compromises that have to be made in order to sustain the ecosystem which sustains us. It's not the other way around. And when I leave the park and see that millions of people that depend upon the land, the air, and the water for their very survival, I just want to try and help humanity, and this is sounding pretty grand of me as a single person, but I guess it's a personal philosophy, try to help people to understand that we aren't the be-all and end-all of creation. As wonderful as humanity is, we depend upon all of the other components of the ecosystem for our very survival, for our physical survival, for our spiritual welfare as well.
Prince Albert National Park in Saskatchewan is a fascinating place to visit in any season. I hope you'll find some time to come here and explore the park for yourself, because here you're not dwarfed by the grandeur of an ancient mountain range or dominated by the power of a huge ocean. Somehow you are, well, I guess I would say, vertical man in a horizontal world, and you certainly can get back in touch with nature. If you do come here, take time to get right down to the earth and look at some of the mini ecosystems that exist in this wonderful boreal forest. I'm Ann Martin. I'll see you next time on Top of the World.